down 8% a year. Perhaps more to the point of how things will affect us directly very soon. Last year, the Mexican national oil company, Pemex, declared that its supergiant field was officially past peak and in decline. And as in the case with Ghawar in Saudi Arabia, Cantarell has been responsible for 60% of Mexico's oil production. Cantarell is now crashing at an official decline rate of at least 15% a year and perhaps more. Mexico has been our number 3 source of oil imports after Canada and Saudi Arabia. And the crash of the Cantarell field means in just a few years, our number 3 source of imports will have no surplus oil to sell to the U.S. It also means that the Mexican government will be strapped for operating revenue. And you can draw your own implications, your own conclusions about the political implications of that. The North Sea and Alaska's North Slope were some of the last great discoveries of the oil era. Plentiful North Sea and Alaskan production took away OPEC's leverage over the oil markets. This led to the oil glut of the 1990s eventually, driving oil prices down finally to about $10 a barrel at the turn of the millennium. It's also what induced the American public to fall back asleep on energy issues, because it seemed as if cheap oil was here to stay forever and that all the disruptions of the 1970s were just a shuck and jive. Both the North Sea and Alaska are now also past peak and in depletion. Prudhoe Bay, by the way, proved to be Alaska's only supergiant oil field. Several other key fields were discovered, but none of them were 1/6 the size of Prudhoe Bay. North Sea oil, which was jointly owned by the UK and Norway, was produced using the latest and greatest new technology for drilling. And guess what? It only allowed that region to be drained more efficiently and more rapidly. So now 57 of Norway's 69 oil fields are past peak, and the average post-peak decline rates average 17% a year, which is very, very steep. You know, it basically means 5-6 years they're out. Not to mention their ability to export. The UK's share of the North Sea has declined to the extent that England is now a net energy importer after 20-odd years of enjoying this fabulous North Sea bonanza that allowed them to suburbanize a lot of England. Russia, despite current high levels of post-Soviet era production, peaked in the 1980s and may now be as much as 70% into its ultimate recoverable reserves. Iran is past peak. Indonesia, an OPEC member, is so far past peak that it became a net oil importer last year, as did England. Venezuela is past peak. Iraq and Nigeria are consumed by political insurrection. The companies developing Canada's tar sands have announced this past year that their costs will double. Their production costs will be double original estimates. In other words, whatever comes out of the ground there is going to be very expensive. Meanwhile, in the background, ignored by the U.S. media, an additional problem is developing on the oil scene. Net world production is going down by just under 3% a year. And this is just in the last year over year. It's not a very long rear-view mirror, but that's what we're seeing. The more ominous thing is that total exports from the top 10 exporters are going down at a steeper rate than that. Geologist Jeffrey Brown, among the excellent technicians at the website theoildrum.com, writes that the top 10 exporters are showing a net export decline of 7% the past year, trending toward a 50% export decline over the coming 10 years. That means half of the oil that we're used to sending out to the importing nations will not get there. And why is this? Why? Because on top of production decline rates, nations like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela are using more of their own oil at home as their populations rise. They use more cars, more appliances, etc. They desalinate more water. This is all very costly in energy. And a few more background items. Most of the easy-to-get light and sweet crude oil is gone. We got that out of the ground in the run-up to the peak. We found that kind of high-quality oil in the temperate places onshore, in places like Texas, where it was easy to work and the stuff was relatively close to the surface. And the remaining oil is each year proportionately made more of heavy and sour crudes that are hard to refine and yield less gasoline. Most of the refinery capacity in the world cannot process these heavy and sour crudes, and there is no world-class industrial effort being made to build new refineries that could process them. And most of the oil refinery infrastructure in the world is very, very old and rusty. In the U.S., most of it is 50 to 70 years old. Finally, most of the remaining oil in the world exists either in geographically forbidding places where it's extremely difficult and expensive to work, like deep water out in the ocean, or in frozen regions, or else it belongs to people who are indisposed to being friendly toward us. The natural gas situation is equally ominous, with some differences in the technical details. And by the way, I'm referring here not to gasoline, but to methane gas, CH4, the stuff that we light our kitchen stoves with and run our home furnaces. And half the furnaces in America are run with natural gas. Natural gas doesn't deplete slowly like oil does, following a predictable bell curve pattern. It simply stops coming out of the ground very suddenly, and then that particular gas well is played out. So you get the gas from the continent you're on. And to get it elsewhere by other means is very expensive and difficult. So that's the background on our energy predicament. Against this background is the whole question of how we live in the United States. I wrote 3 books previously about the fiasco of suburbia. There are many ways of understanding and describing this. I now call it the greatest misallocation of resources in the history of the world. Why? Because it's a living arrangement with no future. It was designed to run on cheap oil and gas, and in a few years, we're not going to have those things. Having made those choices, we're now hobbled by a tragic psychology of previous investment, which is to say, we have poured so much of our late 20th century wealth into this living arrangement, this happy motoring utopia, that we can't imagine letting go of it or substantially reforming it. And we've compounded the problem lately by making the building of suburban sprawl the basis of our economy. That's what the housing bubble has been all about. Roughly 40% of the jobs created since 2001 have been in bubble-related fields. The builders, the mortgage brokers, the installers of granite countertops. And if you subtract that from the rest of the economy, there's not much left besides fried chicken, hairstyling, and open heart surgery. So we can see the tragedy of this and the tragedy of the housing bubble itself as it now begins to unwind. So what are we going to do about our extreme oil dependence and the living arrangement that goes with it? There's a widespread wish across America these days that some combination of alternative fuels will rescue us, will allow us to continue enjoying by some other means what has been called the non-negotiable American way of life. This wish is perhaps understandable given the psychology of previous investment. But the truth is that no combination of alternative fuels or systems for running them will allow us to continue running America the way we're running it now, or even a substantial fraction of it. We're not going to run Walmart, Walt Disney World, Monsanto, and the interstate highway system on any combination of solar or wind or hydrogen, nuclear, ethanol, tar sands, oil shale, methane hydrates, thermal depolymerization, or zero-point energy, or used French fried potato oil, or anything else you can name. We will use many of these things in many ways, and we should use many of these things in many ways, but we are likely to be disappointed by what they can actually do for us. For instance, we're much more likely to use wind power on a household or neighborhood or district basis than to build these deployments of Godzilla-sized turbines in gigantic wind farms. The key to understanding what we face is that we have